everyone, in this video I'm going to show you how to create a upstream Kubernetes cluster using command line utility in Rafay platform. Now if you see the screen, you will see a cluster page. Now once you create a cluster here, this is the page where you'll see all your clusters. Now let's look at how do you create this using the Rafay command line utility. Now I already have a config file prepared, config1.yaml. If you see, this configuration file has the API version, this kind cluster, metadata, which includes cluster name, the project wherein this cluster will be created, and it has Rafay blueprint details, and it has the actual cluster configuration. Now this cluster configuration has node details. The prerequisite to create an upstream Kubernetes cluster is you should have the nodes, the machines. In this particular demo, I'm using Ubuntu machines, and I already have two machines ready, and the machine details are populated in this node section. And when I say machine details, for example, host name of that machine, the operating system, the private IP of that machine, and what is the role that you want to basically give to that machine. In this case, I'm just giving both control plane as well as worker node to that node, and this is the public IP of that machine, and this is the SSH key which the Rafay system will use to connect to the node and run the installer, and this is the username which the system will use to connect to the node. Now this is how the cluster configuration looks like. Now let's see how you can use this configuration file to create a upstream Kubernetes cluster in Rafay platform. Now let's I already have a CLI, Rafay CLI downloaded. Now let's try to initialize this CLI before we'll use it. Now I already have config.json, which contains the API key and the project details. Now once the CLI is initialized, you just have to use single command to create the cluster. Now the command is RCTL apply -f, and then just give the configuration file that I just showed you above. Now if you see, the command basically, the system basically SSH used the key file to connect to the node and ran the installer, and the installer did some pre-checks to make sure node has all the prerequisites, and it just applied the cluster configuration file on that node. Now this cluster, we basically are creating a Kubernetes cluster on version 1.29.4. Now let's see how this particular cluster is progressing. You can also look at the status of this cluster using RCTL status apply, and just use this task ID which is returned as part of the first apply command. Now if you see, this cluster has actually started getting created. It is in progress. Now let's look at the UI, how it looked. If you see, this cluster has actually started getting created, right? If you see, the node is in the discovered state. Now in some time, the node will automatically get approved and the cluster will start getting provisioned. Now if you see, node automatically got approved, and it is right now in the pre-test stage, and it just got provisioned as well. Now if you see, the cluster is getting provisioned on the system. Now if you see, the cluster is provisioned. If you see, cluster creation is success, blueprint sync just started, and task set is complete. If you go to the UI, if you see, cluster is actually provisioned. Now in some time, you will see the blueprint sync process will start. Now if you see, the blueprint sync process has started. So now if you see, blueprint sync is successful. Now if you see, our cluster is ready with version 1.29.4. and we created this cluster using a single command, RCTL apply -f cluster configuration file, and created a fully functional Kubernetes cluster in Rafay platform. Now let's, because it's created on 1.29.4, and let's upgrade this cluster from this version to the latest version, which is 1.30.1, but using our RCTL configuration file. Now let's go back to the terminal back and open the configuration file that we used, and you just have to change the version and reapply the configuration file, which is the latest version. Save the configuration file and just reapply, friends. So if you see, it started it started upgrading the cluster. Now let's look at the status of this apply command and see if it actually went into in progress state. Yeah, it actually went into in progress state. That means the upgrade has started. Now let's look at the UI. If you go to the cluster, and if you see the upgrade job, the upgrade actually is started. So if you see, the upgrade actually finished. Now let's go to UI. Now if you see the UI, here also the upgrade finished. Now let's successfully upgraded from version 1.29.4 to 1.30 using RCTL. Now let's do one more thing. So we saw how to provision a cluster using RCTL. We saw how to upgrade using RCTL. Now let's see how to add a node to this cluster. So we already have one node, which is basically a control plane as well as a worker node. We will add one more worker node to this cluster using the RCTL configuration file. Let's go to the CLI. Now I already have a YAML file. If you see, we first created a cluster with just this node, which was acting as control plane as well as worker. Now I just added one more node to this existing cluster, and the role is worker node. I just pre-populated the new machine details, which is IP, private IP, public IP, and key is the same, which the system will use to SSH to the new node and run the installer. Now let's config to add a new node. You just have to do RCTL apply -f config to.yml. Now if you see, the latest apply that we did on the config file, which had new node, is successfully done. So it basically ran the installer, and then the installer did some pre-checks on the new node, and then it basically applied the new node, change node addition, and it is in pending stage. Now let's look at if actually it's progressing. Up status apply, and then use the task ID. If you see, it actually is in progress. That means node addition has started on this cluster. Let's go to UI and look at the UI. If you see the nodes, a new node is actually getting discovered. Now it'll automatically get approved, and then slowly it'll start getting added to this existing Kubernetes cluster. So if you see, this new node also got added to this cluster successfully. Now we have a fully functional Kubernetes cluster with latest version 1.30.1 and with 2 nodes. Now if you see, in this particular exercise, what we did, we did two things. We did three things. We first created a cluster using RCTL command line utility, and second thing, we basically upgraded the cluster from 1.29.4 to 1.30.1, and third thing, we just basically added the new node to this existing cluster using RCTL command line utility. And in this way, you saw how you can basically easily manage your cluster using the Rafay command line utility. I hope you liked this video. Thanks a lot for watching. Bye.